So hi folks, it's nice to see some familiar faces again. Okay, so my topic is React, Relay and GraphQL, and you might have heard these buzzwords before, especially GraphQL, where there's been a lot of hype in the past few years. And so before we go on to this topic, I want to tell you a bit about who I am, like what work I do, and plus why is my talk relevant and why am I relevant to this topic. So currently I work at a company called Atlassian, and in the past 6-7 months, if you've ever created an issue on Jira, it's probably you've probably run some code that I have written. And the next time it breaks, it's probably because I wrote some code that did not work as expected. Before this, I worked at a company called Razorpay, and hopefully if you've done payments with Razorpay, you might have run some code that one of your merchants is using. Outside of work, I do some open source work, specifically around Webpack and its ecosystem. And when I'm not working, I'm playing either Factory or Stardew Valley. Okay, now coming to the point, why is this information relevant and why am I relevant to this topic? So before I joined Atlassian, all of my experience had been with working with REST APIs. And at Atlassian, it was the first time I was actually using GraphQL at work and in combination with Relay. So when I joined, I was very skeptical about why should one even bother with using GraphQL? Like what with the effort that you're putting in, are you even getting any extra advantage that GraphQL offers and the REST API does not? And looking at how Atlassian uses Relay in combination with GraphQL and React really sort of opened my eyes, to like how the three things work together and why Atlassian is able to build large applications so quickly. So, with a show of hands, how many of you know what GraphQL is? Okay, a few hands. And how many of you have worked with GraphQL before? Cool, so some people have worked. I was expecting much fewer numbers actually. Okay, regardless, so for people who are not familiar with what GraphQL is, let me give you a very brief idea about it. So if you've used REST API, GraphQL is an alternative to like fetching data from a REST API. So instead of using a REST API, you'd use a GraphQL API. Now with GraphQL APIs, you're hitting endpoints. So if you want to fetch some data for a user, you'd probably be hitting an API call /users. And you use some HTTP method like get or post, and you get some data about the user. But GraphQL does not work like that. The way GraphQL does things is you tell the API upfront exactly what data you need, and it will only return that data to you. So over here, it works on the basis of a schema. And if you've ever used SQL before, you might find this familiar. So over here I have a type fill. For this I'm using an API that has some data about the Star Wars film series if you watched it. So over here I have a type fill, right? And so a film can have information like the title of the film, who the director is, and the day that the film, like the object was created, and what all characters have acted in that movie, the characters on the people. So GraphQL has a strongly typed schema, well, relatively strongly typed, and so this is, I just wanted to give you a brief idea that it works on a GraphQL schema, and we have over here an interactive environment where we can interact with a GraphQL API. On the left we have the place where we type what the query. There's a button that runs the query, and on the right we get a response from the API. Now let's try to fetch some data for related to Star Wars movies. So I can give the query any name. Let's call it movie data. Please ignore all typos. So on the left I have an explorer which allows me to look at the types and what all data I can get from the GraphQL environment. So I can click on root. I see that these are the types and nodes that I can fetch. I'm more interested in fetching the data for some films. So I can click on films, film connection, and there will be an object called film over here. So we can see over here again that a film can have a title, it can have the name of the director, and it can have some a list of characters, which is the character connection. Right. So we'll try to fetch this data. We'll type in all films. Under films, we can get films. Wait just 1 second. Turn off browser. Right. And you can see here that it has some really nice autocomplete. We'll also look at it in VS Code. So I can get title and I can get the director of this film. I can run this query. Yeah, this is a issue that happens from time to time. Just 1 second. Now the internet's acting up. If a demo goes well, then it's not really a live demo, is it? Cool. So if I run the query now, I can get all of the data for the film. So I'll only get the data that I ask specifically for. So there is no issue of overfetching where you ask for something and the recipient just dumps everything that's present in the database. Now, something different with GraphQL is that I'm fetching the data for films, right? But what if I also want to get some data about the list of characters that have ever appeared in the Star Wars universe? So similarly, I can get a list of all people who have appeared, and under people there's all people in this under people. For each person, I can get their names. Let's also get their birth here maybe, and I can run the query again. So this time it's returned the data from the films, but it's also returned, if I fold this, you can see that it's also returned the data for all the people, specifically the data that I've asked for, which is name and birth here. Now, so if you were using a REST API, this would have been two different requests, right? With one endpoint, you would have requested the data for the films, and you would have sent another request to get the data for the people. But with GraphQL, you just tell the API what data you want and it returns it to you. But now, what I also want to do is, I have a list of characters, but I also want a list of characters based on which films they have appeared in. So for each film, I want to get the list of characters that have appeared in that film. So let's try and fetch that. So I can get characters. Over here, I can get characters again, and I can get the name and the birth here. So I can run this query. Right, so for now, each film, it's returned a list of characters that and their birth years, like the name and the birth year of each character that has appeared in a film. At the same time also returning the list of all the characters in the Star Wars universe. Now if you look at the query closely, you see that this data is getting repeated. Name and birth year. I'm fetching this data twice. But let's say this was a large query, right? And you don't, like the next time you the next time you change some data that you're fetching for a character, you don't want to edit it in two places. So GraphQL has a feature called fragments. Now you can think of composition in GraphQL like you think of composition in React. You extract your reusable components into their own file and then reuse those components. Similarly in GraphQL, we extract reusable fragments into like reusable query stuff into its own fragment. So I can create a fragment called character fragment on the type of person, and I can say for this fragment I will fetch the name and the birth year. Then I can take this fragment wherever I'm fetching the data twice, I can spread it over here. Cool. So now wherever that thing was getting repeated, I extracted that repeated thing into its own fragment and I spread that fragment where it was getting repeated. I can rerun the query and you can see that I'm getting the same data back which I was previously getting. So this was a very brief introduction to GraphQL. This is only what was required for this talk to make sense to you. There's a lot more. I obviously won't going to cover that because I don't have enough time honestly. So let's get back to the topic at hand. So we took a look at GraphQL when we took a look at what fragments are. Now let's also let's move on to what is relay. So I explained to you what is GraphQL, but what exactly is relay? So relay is a GraphQL client that is designed for using GraphQL with React. So it only works with React. For an analogous thing, you can think of React Query for using it with REST APIs. In some ways, React Query is similar to Relay, but in many things it's not. So this is a very unofficial definition of what Relay is, but I think of Relay in three components. The first is that Relay is a compiler. The second is that it is a data fetching library, and the third is it's also state management / data management library. So out of the three, many REST API libraries offer data fetching and data management, but none of them are a compiler. And which is why Relay, in its sense, is very different in like what exactly is the need for a compiler while writing GraphQL queries, and we'll come to that. And we'll also look at why that compiler is important in Relay. Now, okay, starting on to the why. Why I think that Relay with React and GraphQL is the best way you can build, why is it a secret weapon for creating scalable web apps? And I think it's mainly for these three reasons. If you go to the Relay documentation site, there's a lot more, but these three speak the most to me. The first one has to do with what faces the customer, and the other two are more developer focused. Since I'm a developer, I pay more attention to reusability and type safety. But let's start with the US aspect. Why is it better for the customers and the users that we're building the app for? So it's for two reasons, and we'll look at them closely. But for these things to make sense, what I've done is I've created a demo app using the Star Wars API that we previously looked at. And let's actually look at the demo app as well. So it's fairly simple. It has two sections, exactly the same data that we looked at in the interactive environment. It's fetching a list of films, and it's fetching a list of people. And for each film, it's showing the title of the film, the day it released, and also the first 5 characters that have appeared in the film. If I took all of the characters that appeared in the film, this would be a very large page. So I decided not to do that. And I have the development server running as well. Right. So there is a live version of this app. And if I refresh the browser, the internet's working fine now. So we can see it live. Cool. So that was about the demo app. And we'll take a look at the demo app closely, but I also want to take you through its okay, I forgot to change it here. Cool. So it's mainly just 4 components. The screen that you previously saw was the home page. There's 2 sections obviously, so films and people. Each film uses a film, the films list uses a film component to obviously show the film. And the people component uses a person component to display any information about that particular character. Now to show reusability, what I've done is when I'm showing the list of characters for each film, I have reused the person component in both places. So if you look at the demo, this thing, like Luke Skywalker and the Luke Skywalker over here are actually the same component to show reusability. Right, so that let's also take a very brief look at what the code looks like. Like I said, home component has, hopefully you're able to see this, or should I zoom in more? So the home page has films component, people, under films there's film component, and then it uses the film component to show a list of, like to show some details about the film. And similar to what we saw the query, each component also declaratively says that this is the data that I need. We'll come to this later, but right now I wanted to give you a very brief intro. And then there's a person component that shows some information about the person itself. Now, moving back onto the slides, let's come to the first reason. And probably the most important, because this is a customer facing thing. So Relay allows you to fetch data and component code in parallel. Now what this means is, imagine if you're going to Jira. Okay, how many of you have used Jira before? Okay, a lot of people. Okay, so whenever you click on a modal, take for example the global, the create issue model that's in the top of the nav bar. You click on the modal, you see a modal, and there's also some associated data that needs to be fetched from a backend API to show what the data is. Now, if you look at it, you're fetching two different things. You're fetching the code for the modal, and then you're also trying to get from the server the data that needs to be shown in the modal. Now, if you think about it, these two things are not exactly dependent on each other. But this is what we usually do, right? You first, if you use something like React.lazy, then the browser fetches the component code, it renders the modal, then there's probably a use effect, or if you're using React query, it internally will have some use effect somewhere. Then it does a network fetch, and then it shows the data in the modal. But if you think about it, you don't need to do this thing, these two things serially. They can be done parallelly as well, right? And that's where relay comes in. So relay allows you to fetch the component code as well as the network request in parallel. So your network request is no longer waiting for your component code to get downloaded. Now to show this in the demo, what I've done is I've created a modal like that. Let's open the network tab so we're able to look at it closely. It might be a little difficult to see over here, but pay attention to the flame graph. Now what I built is if you click on a character, it will show some data about the character in the modal. If I click on Luke Skywalker, it shows Luke Skywalker's name, eye color, hair color, height and mass. But if I go to all over here, can you see this part? If you look at the flame graph, it's a little difficult to see, but there are two lines over here which say that the two lines are parallel and not serial, which say that you fetch the component code and the network data parallel, and not like the network fetch request did not wait for your component code to load. So this is one of the biggest features, I'd say, because right now this is a very small example, but think on the scale of having a very large modal which has to fetch a lot of data and has a lot of code behind it. And if you fetch both of those things in parallel, you can approximately save like 200 milliseconds on the modal load. And the bigger your code and network fetch, the more time you save actually. So this is one. Now let's look at the other thing that majorly helps user experience. I showed you the code, right? Over there you saw that each component tells relay exactly what data it needs. Now, if you think about the REST, its REST API counterpart, over there I think of two major approaches. Either using something like React query, where you use the use query hook, and you'd have to pass down the data as props. And if you're not doing that, you're probably fetching the data from somewhere else and putting all of that data in Redux, and then your component reads that data from a store like Redux or whatever state management library that you're using. But if you look at the code in relay, you can see that I'm not doing anything like that anywhere. I'm simply telling relay that I have a fragment over here, and for person, I want to get the name and the ID. And I'm using that directly over here. So similarly, if I go to people, the list of people, the only thing I'm telling relay is that I want a list of people. I no longer have to worry about how that data is coming to my component. All I have to worry about is how I can get data to render, which is basically taking this data and using map and rendering each person in a list. So this is, I feel, is a major. So this was more like a developer side, but now that each component tells relay what data it needs, but how does relay figure out, okay, this component needs this data, and I want to get this data from the server, and this is where the compiler comes in. So what relay does is, if I look at the home page, I've spread all of the fragments here. Now relay uses its compiler. So I have the relay compiler running as a separate process over here with yarn relay. And what it's doing is, it's taking a look at this query and every fragment that is spread over here, and it is compiling down an efficient version of this query. So even if you fetch duplicate data somewhere else, what it will do is deduplicate that data, so you only get that data once. And now it will take all of these separate fragments, compile it down into one query, and for all of the data that you fetch on a page, it will send a single network request. And if we look at our demo, that is exactly what is happening. If I go to fetch and refresh my page, you can see that this is something we saw in the interactive environment as well, but we are using a single request, and all of the data related to the fields as well as all the characters is getting fetched in a single query rather than multiple separate queries. Now this is important because if you've used REST API, you have multiple endpoints, then you have to show a loader for each API. Plus you'd have some instances like, okay, you're showing something, you've sent one network request, and based on the response from that network request, you're sending another network request. Take for example a user's profile. First you fetch some basic details about the user, then you take the user's ID, and then you send that user ID back to the server to get more details about the person. But with Relay, you no longer have to do that, since it has already compiled all of that query, all of your fragments into a single query, and it sends across a single query to the server. And if you want to look at what this query actually looks like, this is everything that Relay will generate when the compiler is run. If you look at home query, this is basically, it generates some JSON data, and at runtime it takes this JSON, and yeah, the bigger thing is that it's doing this at build time, so it's not going to waste your memory or CPU when your app is running in the browser. So it's generated a version of this query, and it will take this from this file at runtime and use this directly rather than having any kind of runtime calculation. So that was everything for the user. But if Relay is bad for the developer, then why would you want to use it, right? So to obviously not, okay, this was an explanation for a slide that I forgot to show you. So yeah, this just a diagram saying that, for each fragment it has compiled it down to a query at the top level, and you can fetch all of the data for your complete page in a single query. Now coming to the developer aspects, why Relay also helps developer, and one of the core aspect is reusability of component. If you remember, I told you that the person component is used in two places. One for showing a list of all the people, and the other for also showing a list of characters appearing in a film. Now let's say you are building the Star Wars app for your company, and your product manager comes and tells you that, Burhan, you're just, for now, if you look at the demo, the product manager tells you that, Burhan, okay, you're only showing the list of characters, but the product requirement was to also show the birth year. But what you have done is, you did not know that, and you have used the person component everywhere. And you'd have to make a lot of changes everywhere your person component was getting used, which would include making sure that the birth year data was getting passed down to your person component wherever it was getting used, and that would be a lot of work. You'd have to go to each place that the person component was getting used and pass it down as a prop. But with Relay, if you look at the code, what I can simply do is that if a request did come in like that, I can simply say I want to fetch the birth year, right? And I can save that, so the Relay compiler runs again, which it has done, and I can say over here that, okay, I want to start rendering the birth year as well over here. Cool. And if I go back to the demo now, you can see that it's appeared in both places with just 2 lines of change, one for fetching the data and one for rendering it. Even if your component was getting used in 1,000 places, as long as your fragment was getting spread in all of those queries, it would work out of the box for you. Now, coming to my favorite reason for it is probably type safety. And all of this is thanks to the work that the Relay compiler does for you. Now it's doubly type safe. And I'll show you how. If you look back at the code, you saw how I wrote down birth here, and it knows what the type is. If I hover over it, it knows that it can either be string, null, or undefined. And that's because of the schema. When I show you the schema on that website, Relay also has access to the schema because I have copied it down here. So it knows exactly what data the server can return and what are the data types that the server can return for each thing. So I get out of the box type safety in both cases. One, I cannot request any data that the server cannot return. If after this I type in, so it obviously gives you type data if you want autocomplete, but let's say I try to fetch something entirely that's not on the server. If I try to fetch something like hello world, it will give you an error over here saying that person does not have a field called hello world. So you cannot fetch this from the server. So if you ever make a typo, which happens very often, you cannot do that with React because it will give you an error upfront saying that you cannot fetch this or does not exist. Now, let's say there is some data that does exist, but I've forgotten to fetch it from the server, right? So if I try to render home world over here, which does exist on the server, but I've forgotten to fetch it from the server, it will give me an error again saying that the data that you're trying to render does not actually exist. And so it gives an error as long as I don't have it in the fragment. If I add home world over here, and let's say whatever, we try to fetch the climates of the character's home world, and when it has run again, well, let's take something simpler actually. Let's take the eye color, and we can save, and relay compiler will run, and we now have access to eye color again. So it will only allow you to use data that you're already fetching from the server, and this is why it's doubly type safe. You cannot fetch data that does not exist on the server, and if the data does exist on the server but you are not fetching it, you cannot use that either. And when you have very large APIs, this is where it comes in handy. To conclude, yeah, Relay is pretty cool. The code for this demo, all of the 3 features is available on GitHub. It's a public repo, and if you want to get started with Relay, the tutorials is the best place to go. And if you have any questions, now is the time to ask them.